The views expressed in this podcast stems from our passion for the security industry and for the physical security operations. They do not necessarily reflect the views of our employers. Welcome to Security Theater with Scott and Carlos, where we pull back the curtain on the world of security.
I'm Scot Walker, your co-host, with years of experience in the trenches of the military, federal law enforcement, and corporate security.
And I am Carlos Francisco, here to debunk the myths and misconceptions that surround the security industry.
In Security Theater, we dive deep into the realities behind security measures, exposing what's truly effective and what's just for show.
I agree, and we'll tackle controversial topics, interview industry experts, and share stories from our own careers that reveal the often hidden truth about security.
So whether you're a security professional, a curious skeptic, or someone just looking to understand the world of security better, join us every week for a no-holds-barred discussion.
And get ready to see beyond smoke and mirrors. This is Security Theater.
All right, let's get started. This is Security Theater. I'm Scot Walker. Carlos Francisco is on assignment, we'll say. He's indisposed. Carlos is a very busy guy. He's got a couple of little ones. So it's just me and our guest, Rachael Spanton. And thank you very much for being here, Rachael. We'll talk about some different things that we haven't talked about on the podcast. This is going to be largely about private sector intelligence. And Rachael, why don't you do a little introduction about what you do and what your business does, and then we'll get into it.
Perfect. Hi, thanks Scott for having me. Yep, so I'm Rachael Spanton. So I head up Victoria Intelligence. So our focus is on helping companies to build out great intelligence programs. And my background is I started as an intelligence analyst in the police, in Surrey Police in the UK. And then I spent about 10 years in BP doing basically every intelligence role they'd let me do, from being a geopolitical intelligence advisor, heading up the 24/7 analysis team, and then building out their operational intelligence capability.
Awesome. All right. So you also have a law enforcement background. You're an analyst with the police department there in the UK, and that's really super cool. We talk with a lot of people about their transition from law enforcement in the private sector, so we'll get into that too. But let's just start off with, a lot of people aren't familiar with what private intelligence services do. How do you help? You help businesses, you help individuals, high net worth people. Who are the kind of people that you're helping, and how do you do what you do? How does that translate into, a lot of businesses focus on return on investment? How do you help them understand risks and threats better?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people, when they hear like private intelligence, they think of like spies or corporate espionage or stuff like that. And that's definitely not what I do. So like I look at intelligence as being an enabling function. So we help companies to operate, to stay profitable, to, go into new markets, to just keep their people safe. So in a private environment, an intelligence program really just helps a company keep their people safe, keep their assets safe, and just understand the world a little bit better. And really, it'll differ depending on the company. So, big tech companies can have a very different corporate intelligence program to maybe a smaller energy company or something like that. But all of those companies will have something in common, which is intelligence is just information you can do something with. It's news you can use. And so wherever you point that, it kind of has that same sort of commonality running through it. And a lot of intelligence programs work very close, well, pretty much all intelligence programs work very closely with their security teams to really provide that threat insight so that the security teams can then work out what the risk is to an asset, to a company. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What I always say is that the world is getting smaller. Our supply chains are becoming shorter. They're becoming more brittle. You know, we need to, and to your point, moving into new markets, I think a lot of organizations need to understand the risks, and they don't. And they kind of go in thinking like, oh, I've got a great relationship with somebody on the ground, and we're just going to we're going to go operate in this new environment. And they don't quite understand that, you know, it sounds like you focus also on geopolitical risk as well as, you know, the threats and the normal threats and risks and any security team's looking at, which is everything from theft to fire, flood, and political, you know, insurrections from a junta military. So what's the big difference between, or what have you experienced as differences between running a big program? British Petroleum's huge, you know, global leader in oil and natural gas. So you went from, you have all these resources probably and a lot of assets, and you're doing things on a global scale, to now running a business on your own. And are there differences that you can impart on some good experiences that maybe you've had that can let some of our listeners are small business owners as well, and some of our listeners come out of corporate security and they want to know, like, what are the big differences between running your own business and coming out of a big business?
Yeah, so I guess I was very lucky in BP that we had a very well established intelligence team that sort of had, I guess, a lot of support internally from senior leaders. So we sort of, you know, the company could see the value in what we gave. So there wasn't a continual process of having to prove the value, to have to kind of convince people that we were needed and things like that. And so I think having a company with a established intelligence program that has seen the value is, you're just off to a good start. Whereas, you know, from a smaller company, which like I am now, like you have to sort of show the value, you have to convince people of the value, and lots of people won't see the value until something bad happens. So it's very hard, I think, for a smaller company to either convince their senior leaders to have better intelligence support, or like grow their intelligence program if nothing bad has ever happened. So I think the main difference that I've found day to day is that I have to spend a lot more time trying to articulate the value of intelligence, and also maybe to people that don't deal with it day in and day out. So how do you sort of help people understand, firstly, you know, what intelligence is and what it isn't, but then also help them see the value that it brings to their company, especially as, you know, every company is focused on just how can they reduce costs or make more money. And so often security and intelligence is just looked at as like a cost, right? So how do you convince people that it is, but also if you neglect it, then you're leaving value on the table. And actually, really the value of an intelligence program is as an enabling function. So it helps you to operate more confidently, like it helps you to kind of get ahead of your competition in all those kind of ways. But it still is a hard thing to articulate until a company has had a big catastrophe. And then they're like, okay, now I can see that we need to get ahead of this and do it. So I think that is, and I think as well, the difference that I've seen, you know, I'm a very, Victoria Intelligence is small and it's very new. A lot of companies do seem to default to like the name brand recognition for security and intelligence. And I think that's just because it's a bit comforting. So if you go to one of, you know, the big established names, it's like, okay, so I trust them. They've been in the business for a long time. You know, they have that reach or whatever. And I think the other challenge is, how do you make someone trust you really quite quickly? Because, you know, they don't have to. They've got loads of other people who they could go to and things like that. And especially in intel and security, it's an area that I think, you know, it does concern people. So you have to try and get that trust across as soon as possible. So I think the main differences are around having to prove the worth and articulate the value, and then also get people to trust you when you're an untested quantity.
Yeah, I always say, especially for folks in the private sector who are running their own small, medium-sized businesses, people don't, if they don't know, like, and trust you, they're not going to do business with you, you know. And that's for anything. It's not just, you know, corporate intelligence. So it's interesting to hear that obviously trust is really important, because they're trusting you with maybe a classify or something that they're not making public. You know, hey, we're going to go into this market. Hey, we've got a new product or service coming out that we want to roll out. What are the risks there? With a big program, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners who come out of or in corporate security and they're in leadership roles, and they want to get a new program started doing intelligence for their company, but they maybe don't know what some of the challenges are. Can you speak to that? What you experienced going in a kind of a big company and that had a global reach with building the program or operating that program? What are some of those challenges there?
Yeah, so I think one of the first ones to kind of work out is around positioning. So sort of where to position your intelligence program. So a lot of companies, their intelligence team come below security, and that works for some people. Like there is, I think, an argument to be made to have security and intelligence a bit more independent, just because if you've got an intelligence team that are providing a view of threat, I think it often ends up being more impactful if they're a little bit more independent of the security sort of. So we work like in the same team, but maybe Intel wouldn't report into security, or maybe that is what you need. I think just that is one of the first things to think about, is the positioning. And I think as well, it's important to sort of be really clear on what you want your intelligence program to be doing and to be achieving. And to do that, you probably also need to be really thinking about what the company as a whole is trying to do and trying to achieve in the sort of the short and the long term. I think if you're just looking at, okay, so I'm really worried about, I don't know, like Yemen, and then let's just build up a team around that, then you might get something, but you're not necessarily going to get a program that is enabling your team and your company to sort of operate at a higher level and to grow with you. So I think taking like a little bit of time just to focus on what is the company trying to achieve, where are they going, and then what do we need the intelligence program to do, and also what the company needs the intelligence program to do, rather than necessarily what you need the intelligence program to do. I think focusing on that will just give you more chance of success. And then you can think about the positioning, then you can think about, sort of even things like the budget side of things, what sort of, I think is what's really important to think about, what kind of roles you need in the team. So not just enough to be like, okay, we need an intelligence analyst, because I mean, there are like so many different types of intelligence analysts. You want one that has a background in imagery or like geopolitics or like open source sort of. So try and think about, okay, so based on everything we've looked at so far, so what the company needs to do, what I need to do, like what are the skills we actually need, and then you're just going to get someone that's probably much more fit for purpose. So I'd say just spending a little bit of time to kind of focus on that structural side of things, and then making sure that you get someone that fits into that and then can sort of progress the team forward or stand you in good stead.
That's great. And I'll ask the next question around what kind of skills does somebody who's going to either get into this or is interested in doing this, what kind of skills do they need? What kind of education do they need? This is also important for folks who are building the organization or want to build a program. You came out of school, went into a law enforcement organization, then transitioned to the private sector. So kind of how does that all come together? What kind of experience are you what do you find most important to have in a private sector, even though you came out of kind of government, if you will?
Yeah. So do you mean like mainly in the intel side of things, or just?
Yeah.
So I mean, for me, it's less important the exact degree that you've got or something like that, because I think the thing that sort of like unifies like great intelligence analysts or great intelligence professionals is that curiosity and that kind of inquisitiveness and like probably being a bit nosy, and that sort of the ability just to sort of keep picking at something until you work it out, and sort of to keep asking more and more questions. And I think that is something that can be across a whole host of different degrees. Like I've worked with people who have degrees in like ancient history or have degrees in like psychology like me, or just a very wide variety of different things. So at least if I was hiring people, it's not like I need someone to have like an international relations degree or like a war studies degree or something like that. It's more important for me to know how they think and how they approach problems. So I realize that that's maybe a bit of a vague, like wishy-washy answer, but I think that is more useful. And I've always found that that if I focus on how someone thinks and how they approach problems, then they end up being like better hires and better intelligence sort of team members than if they just happen to tick boxes. So I think in terms of if people are looking to get into a career in intelligence, and I do speak to quite a few people looking to do it, I think it's focusing on developing out those just quite soft skills of like curiosity and also just things like on a basic level, like writing well and speaking well and being able to like write good requirements. Like those sort of things are things that you can learn in a whole host of different roles as well. So even though obviously like you can develop great intelligence skills like in government, like, and they'll teach you really, really well, there is the potential to learn those skills like in different roles as well and in different industries. And I think I think any team that has a wide variety of backgrounds in it is always so much stronger. So I think having people that have maybe come from like a commercial world or journalism and government, it always ends up being a much sort of stronger team holistically. So I realize again that hasn't really laid out like a consistent path, but I think it's more the way someone thinks rather than exactly what degree they have that I find important in an intelligence team.
I agree with you as well. One of the best intel operators I had in the government had an art degree, and she was, because that gave her that ability to see things way differently than all of us that came out of military and law enforcement. And that's what we needed. We needed somebody who could be dynamic and think about the problems differently. You're so right about writing as well. Or what I'll say is communicating your ideas, your thoughts, or the risks, because is it your experience? This is my experience, so I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts here is. In government, we document things to document them, right? And we write them down, and it's a big report, and there's a lot of effort put into the product and to the analytics of the product. And perhaps a senior leader reads, the executive summary, and then that's it. Coming in the private sector, they're like, this is great, it's huge. Can you just summarize it in like 5 bullet points in an email? That they don't want a lot of data. And in fact, there may be even some legal reasons not to do that, with discovery and things like that. I don't know if they have that in the UK, but certainly a concern in the United States. But so I'm just kind of curious if that's also your experience, because I agree with you. I think you don't necessarily have to come out of law enforcement to learn how to do these things, but being able to communicate and then how you communicate, I think, matters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. And I think, and the one thing that I sort of see sometimes being a bit of a challenge for maybe like folk that are coming straight from university is that ability to switch from, that university style of writing, that academic style of writing, to the intel side of things. And especially in a corporate world, because you're right, like no one has time to read your 20-page report, unfortunately. So it definitely, you need to, I think, get really humble about the fact that you might have put like a load of work into this. Like it might be great, it might have some really great insights, but actually what the reader cares about is the one thing that they need to know to sort of make a decision or to take action. And so anything in the report should be sort of helping them go in that direction. And you're right, like probably they're just going to read the executive summary. So you just got to make sure that everything that you need is going to go into that executive summary, and that you're not necessarily showing you're working as much, because again, if you're sort of in that role and you're kind of trusted, then most of the time they should be trusting that you got to it in a good way, but you're just showing your conclusion and what it means for the company. And I think it's that ability to show the so what for the company that is the key really with like intelligence writing, right? Like we're not writing a thesis on like some kind of historical topic. We're being like, the company needs to make this decision and they need this information to do it, and then this is what we have for you. So yeah, and it definitely is a skill that it took me a bit of time to learn it. And I think because coming from the police to then going into the corporate world, it was definitely a different style. So it didn't come like super easy to me. Like I had to have, I had a lot of feedback from my colleagues, and that was super helpful, because you just that's how I learned, was just by having someone be like, this is rubbish, let's get rid of all this and this and this. And again, that comes back to that sort of humility of just being like, okay, I'm not an expert on this straight away, so let's learn from people that maybe know more about it. So yeah, I think being comfortable with the fact that it might be a bit of an adjustment in your writing style if you come straight from uni or you've come from government to the corporate world is probably a good thing to bear in mind.
Yeah, I use the same term. I always ask, what's the so what?
Yeah.
Why is this important? Let's get to the most important things up front. Yeah, sometimes I think people like to document, look, I did a lot of, important work here, and I want it to be acknowledged or recognized, and it should. We should always acknowledge people's hard work. But oftentimes our leadership, to your point, because hopefully they're using this information to make a decision. They're either going to move assets, they're going to move money, they're going to move these things around. So I think that's a great point. How important were relationships in you're making your transition from a law enforcement or government agency into the private sector? Did relationships help you there? Or did being in a common association help you, or having a friend from university? How was that transition for you?
So mine, I guess my transition was probably a little bit squiffy. So I went from the police into BP, but I originally went into a more of a commercial role. So I was in their market intelligence team. So like completely nothing to do really with security, but it was still kind of using those intelligence skills, but it was pointed towards like
intelligence.
Yeah, and around like the markets and things like that. And so in terms of relationships and things like that, not really. But I guess I had sort of a longer term goal that I wanted to try and get into the intelligence team there. And so I was like, okay, so maybe I won't be able to go straight in there, but I can then make a step in the right direction, even if it's not completely, the step that was going to get me there. So I think for me, like relationships weren't as big of a, I guess, help in getting those kind of roles. But I think I know that sort of the industry does sort of run off relationships and things like that. And so it is and that comes back to trust, right? Like you kind of want to be able to like trust and like people. And so that is why people tend to default to people that they know and they're tested and things like that. So, it's definitely something that has a lot of value in maintaining and things like that. But yeah, for me, it was just being a little bit more, I think, lateral in terms of how I was looking at my career progression and be like, as long as the roles that I'm doing are still using those intelligence skills and they're still kind of keeping those skills fresh, even if it's not exactly in the area that I want to be in, at least it's getting me towards that area. And actually, it was a really useful experience because it showed me, again, the much more commercial side of a business and I think something that can be really easy if you go straight from maybe law enforcement into a corporate security world is it still feels quite narrow, and it's easy to forget that you're part of a big company that wants to make money and doesn't really care about you. And so I think for me, like having that slight commercial side of things, like, okay, there's a huge company here that doesn't even know we exist. So let's just actually remember that and focus on helping them to operate and sort of helping them to do what they need to do rather than expecting people to care, blunt.
Yeah.
Pretty blunt.
I used to tell people, we don't arrest people here. We're focused on how to return value to the investors or make a great product or make a great service, and that's for some people in law enforcement, it becomes very difficult once they've made the transition to the private sector, to switch their brain to what's the ROI. We're going to put time and energy in here. We're going to spend money. Are we going to get some value out of it? We don't just investigate or make intelligence products for just the sake of doing those things.
Sorry, I was just going
to
extend the point as well. And I think the other thing that and it took me a bit of time to adjust to this as well, but the idea that, in an intel role, you're not necessarily looking at the most important topic in an area or like a region, but like you're looking at the most important ones to your company. So maybe your region includes Ukraine, but you don't have any operations in Ukraine. You're probably you shouldn't be spending much time on it apart from just maybe keeping a quick eye on it, because if your business doesn't care about it, then you probably don't either. And I think, again, it's having that slight ability to be like, okay, so the biggest story in the world might be this, but if it doesn't impact our company, then it's not something that we're going to be writing about, we're going to be looking at. And that can take a bit of adjustment, I think, like focusing on not just the biggest and most important issues, but the ones that are the biggest and most important to your company, which might be completely different, probably are completely different.
Well, and that's a good, the last question I was going to ask you, it's a good transition to, you probably study a lot of things around the world with your current business. What keeps you up at night? What are you most concerned about in the world, intelligence wise? There's something you're studying right now or you're looking at right now that is very concerning to you?
So you mean like a sort of like a news story or like a sort of geopolitical trend or something?
Yeah,
like that?
it could be anything. What's important to your business, or what are you finding that you're maybe spending a lot of time on that concerns you?
Let me think on that for a minute.
Because I'm sure with a business that has a lot of different clients, you probably have to kind of be an expert in everything, or at least knowledgeable in everything. And so because what made me think of that was when you mentioned Ukraine. There's so much information coming out about Ukraine, and I see it in all my intel feeds as well. And it's great to try and understand the Russian-Ukrainian situation. I think it's got bigger geopolitical risks for Eastern Europe, so that's really kind of what's going to kick off. Is somebody going to invade Eastern Poland, or is it Latvia, Lithuania? What is it? I'm not as interested in understanding kind of the broader impacts for Ukraine itself. So when I look at that kind of information that's coming across my various feeds, it's kind of like I pass through it and I'm looking for the broader impact. So I'm just kind of curious what worries you? You're an intelligence professional. Is there something that and it could be geopolitical, it could be something local to one of your clients?
I think I think especially if I look at like the UK right now, and I think it's kind of the same in the US, and I just feel like it's around like misinformation and just how quickly that can spark things and like spark huge sort of spiraling issues. Like if I think about the UK, like sort of like a few weeks ago we had these like riots, sort of like anti-immigration riots sparked by like a really horrific like murder of like some girls, which was then blamed on like an immigrant. It wasn't even true, and it was just like spiraled. And I think just how the potential for those like small, either like malicious or just accidental reporting to then sort of drive these really horrible like unrest or really horrible kind of reaction. And I think then the underlying thing to that, which is this kind of and again, this is probably more talking about like Europe and the US, but this underlying kind of tension and slightly kind of so what's the word I'm looking for? Like not like nastiness, but the sense that people are kind of on edge and like it's a little bit of a powder keg. And I just think the potential for something quite small to kick off, like some sort of localized violence or like more widespread violence. And I think just because it feels a little bit hard to predict when it will happen, because it's not like we're looking at, okay, so we know maybe the pockets of unrest around the world or the pockets of violence. It's just this idea that because of how easy information is to spread and how easy misinformation is to spread, that it can just so easily spark unrest or like violence kind of anywhere. And I think probably as intelligence professionals, where it's always most worrying the things that we don't know, and we don't know, right? That sort of that you can't necessarily predict and you can't ever mitigate against. So I realize that seems like a little bit of a cop-out answer, because it's like, oh, I worry about the things that I don't know about. But I think it's just how it just feels like there's this sort of like quite tension across lots of communities and kind of areas right now that can so easily be sparked into something quite nasty. And I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to fix that, because that seems like a really deep-seated kind of societal issue that isn't just going to go away if you arrest a terrorist leader or something like that. It's a longer term, more difficult thing to try and address and to fix, and that is probably why it worries me more, because it's going to go on for a while, I think.
Yeah, I don't see an end to that either. I agree with you. I used to think that by this time we would have a lot more fake imagery and video coming out. It's there, certainly, deep fakes and things like that are at work in we're going through an election process here in the US. It's being used, but I think to your point, you'd almost that's too high tech to dissuade or to provide false information about a situation. It's so easy now just to post something on social media, and that it doesn't even have to have an element of truth to it. Your point about the protests in the UK with these horrific murders, immediately it started a fire of controversy when somebody said that there was an immigration aspect to that situation, which turned out not to be the situation, or a religious aspect as well, which turned out not to be the situation. And it didn't matter. The folks were up in arms about it. And I think once people take that step to be go from being a peaceful protester to now an act of violence, whether that be civil disobedience. I'm going to actively resist law enforcement's attempts to get us off the streets or to break up our protest, or it's vandalism and rioting. I think to your point, a lot of these things are driven by information, and so information is so readily available. But I always ask, what are we looking at? Because we've seen where people, bad actors will submit or post something that is, it's a horrific situation, but it's from years ago. And they'll claim, oh, this just happened. Did it just happen? Or is that video or imagery? And it's usually deceptive imagery or deceptive video. Is that something that is current, or did it happen years ago? Or in a completely different part of the world, and I think far too often, and I get these kinds of questions or these kinds of posts. I see them all the time, and it's really even hard as an analyst, because I can imagine for what you do, because where are we getting our information? We have curated feeds, but so much of what is happening in the world, the volume and velocity, I say that a lot, but the volume and velocity of it is just insurmountable. We've never had this much information before. And so going through it and understanding and knowing what to look for is really tough. How do you advise your clients about that? Do you get that sometimes where a client will say, well, I saw on social media this is a bad thing, or I saw, the news told me this. Do you get that where they maybe misunderstand the information that they're seeing?
I think a lot of times people don't always have the context for things. So if I think back to probably more so in BP, but it may be there may be a country that you just see headlines on the news and it's all kind of bad stuff. And so a country like Nigeria, perhaps, we're okay, so there's Boko Haram and there's pirates in the Gulf of Guinea, and also okay, Nigeria must just be dangerous. And then but obviously Nigeria is massive and it's very nuanced. And so I think a lot of times people will see, especially if it's an area they're not familiar with, they'll maybe see a headline and they'll sort of assume that situation or that threat is across the whole country, when it really isn't. And so I think that is something that people often miss, is that nuance and that context, which you just aren't going to get if you just see a headline or see a tweet. So I think that's again a role for the intelligence team, is to be able to put that stuff into context. And I think on the opposite, to be okay, so I know that you're not hearing anything about this area or this region, but actually that's just because no one reports from there's no information coming out of it, and there are all these kind of other things going on. So yeah, I definitely think it's beholden on intelligence professionals to try and help educate our audience as much as possible, and our colleagues, not in a sort of a patronizing way, but just helping them understand these kind of things. And I think it's still, even though we have to wade through all this information and this misinformation and work out what's true and what's not, I think now we're at the point where knowing what disinformation is going out there is almost just as important, because that still drives the narrative and that kind of still impacts things on the ground and stuff. So it wouldn't necessarily impact our analysis or our conclusion, but it does tell us something about maybe what people are hearing, or what people could be, what could be impacting people's sort of thought process and things like that. So we kind of have to also be aware of what is out there in terms of misinformation, whilst knowing that it's not true, and so not using it for our conclusions. But yeah, I think it is something that people often do want to be educated about it, and people do appreciate that kind of feedback of actually sort of because of this and this reason, the situation actually isn't as bad, or it is as bad, and this is why.
Yeah, that's great, and we'll leave it there. Rachael Spanton, Victoria Intelligence. Do you want them to reach out to you, connect with you anyway? What social media? Where would you like them to get a hold of you at?
No, happy to. Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. So either my LinkedIn or Victoria Intelligence. Just very happy to chat with anyone. If you want any advice about how to build your corporate intelligence program, or just you want support to do that, then that's what I do. That's kind of what I've made a career in. So I'm always very happy to chat to anyone and just see what you're trying to achieve and see if we can help.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Rachael.
No problem. Thanks.
views expressed in this podcast stems from our passion for the security industry and for the physical security operations. They do not necessarily reflect the views of our employers.